processed meat is now considered a carcinogenic of the highest category, aligned with smoking. If you consume 70 grams of meat per day over 7 days, then it's not a case of you may, but you will get cancer, and it's just a matter of time. Mixing beverages with food, which is an absolute disaster. Essentially what you are doing is diluting the same acids and enzymes whose sole responsibility is to break down the food for your sake, so that you absorb the best of what that food has to offer. A lot of the issues that we have is not just the foods that we eat, but the way we consume food, from the way that we chew food, the food combinations that we use. We're eating not according to biological availability. You should never eat fruit after a meal. They digest within as little as 7 to 15 minutes. Welcome to the Diet Doctor podcast, where we discuss the science of nutrition and high performance, offering practical tools for everyday life. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا وصدقا وإخلاصا في الدين يا أرحم الراحمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Decided to start this particular episode with a dua, because the episode itself is about the correlation between the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and evidence-based research and what we have come to know today via science and research. So it's a long conversation to have, and it's a conversation that it will take place as the episodes progress, and it's a topic that I don't think will come to any sort of conclusion anytime soon. However, I wanted to touch on what I call some of the hikmah points that exist, and the ones that stand out, and the ones that are very easy to implement into our day-to-day existence, because it's not just to our benefit from a physiological perspective, but it's to our benefit from a spiritual perspective also, because it's an active form of dua. You are actively preserving the sunnah of the beloved Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And the correlations that exist today, that we came to know 1446 years ago now, because we're in the new Hijri year. We're in the month of Muharram, which is one of the foremost blessed months in the lunar calendar. There are many, many correlations, but the ones that stand out and the ones that are most easy to implement are the ones we're going to discuss today. The first being the posture or the preferred position to be in when you are consuming food or drinking water, and that is the seated position. Now, there are 4 different ways that the Prophet ﷺ used to be sitting in. I'm not going to demonstrate them for you now. However, if you do your homework, there are 4 different positions, and one of them is the way that the way you would sit when you're sitting in salah. Another one is when you're sitting down with one knee in front of you. And the other method is when you have both feet in front of you, and Qurfosat is one of the ones that was predominantly used by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these methods were very, very effective at avoiding gastrointestinal distress and bloating and food intolerances, which are rife today. And not all of the issues that we have, but a lot of the issues that we have is not just the foods that we eat, but the way we consume food, from the way that we chew food, the food combinations that we use. We're eating not according to biological availability, mixing beverages with food, which is another thing that we're going to discuss. And the first and foremost is being in the right position when you start to consume food or your beverage. So not only are we not sitting down these days, and we are standing a lot of the time when we consume food, because we live in a rat race of a society, but we are, what's even worse is that we are often walking from A to B as we are consuming food, which wreaks absolute havoc on the digestive system. There's a reason why you have to be sitting down in a state of gratitude, in a state of, you can even say khushu', and presence when you are eating and appreciating what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with in front of you. And if you are in a seated position, if you are in one of those 4 positions, the brain has ample time to communicate with your stomach. The brain, once it receives food, there's a very abstract algorithm that's taking place whereby the brain is telling the stomach what you are about to ingest. For example, if I was to consume a food group that has 3 different types of ingredients, and each ingredient is different. So there's a carbohydrate in that mouthful, there's a protein, and there's a fibrous or cruciferous carbohydrate in the form of a salad or a vegetable. Let's say hypothetically, I wouldn't eat those all together, but hypothetically, let's say I was to consume a mouthful that consisted of a little bit of each of those ingredients. What would happen is the brain would send signals to the stomach based on what you've consumed, and then your stomach will then release the relevant acids and enzymes to those particular food groups in the right quantity. If they are overabundant, you're going to get acid reflux. If there is not enough of them, you're not going to be able to digest your food, and you'll end up with symptoms like constipation and other issues. Now, the brain takes a little bit of time to send that signal to the stomach, and on average, it takes about 7 seconds. While the food is traveling from the esophagus down into the stomach and then later on to the small and large intestines, the food travels at different speeds. Water travels at different speeds, varying from 4 meters per second, slowing down to 2 meters per second, speeding back up to 3 meters per second, for an average duration of about 7 seconds. And that's exactly how much time your brain needs in order to communicate with your stomach efficiently, so that you reap the benefits of what you are consuming, you maximize nutrient absorption, you avoid bloating, gastrointestinal distress, food intolerances that can occur over time, and an array of gastrointestinal issues. Now, if the individual is standing up and consuming the same food, the food then travels to the stomach in a time frame that is less than 7 seconds, whereby the brain has not had ample time to communicate with the stomach, and therefore, when it does arrive, the relevant acids and enzymes are not present, and we often end up with bloating and gastrointestinal distress. And it's not only painful to be in that situation, but it's also uncomfortable. It interferes with how much you absorb the goodness that you could potentially absorb from the food. There are many people that have the same diet but get the same different outcomes. And a lot of the reasons, well, there are a vast array of different reasons why that happens. But you can have 2 individuals eat the same meal. One person is chewing their food correctly, not mixing water with their food, sitting down while they're eating, being conscious of what they're, being in a state of presence while they're consuming their food. And the other person could be standing up, drinking fluids with their food, not chewing their food appropriately or efficiently, and the results are not going to be the same. Just because a piece of chicken may contain 30 grams of protein, it does not mean that that's what I'm going to absorb. It's how I consume the food and the existing condition of my stomach, of course, as well, which is a major variable. If I've got good gut health, then I will be able to absorb a larger quantity of that protein. And we spoke previously about how to keep the gut in prime condition, and having all about the 3 fermented products, such as the fermented beverage and the fermented vegetable and the fermented dairy product, to increase the healthy microbiome in the stomach. And I think we'll have a separate episode, hopefully with a professor of gastroenterology, where we can delve deeply into the microbiota of the stomach. And that's something that I'm very, very fond of. Prophet ﷺ said the worst vessel that a human being can fill is the stomach, because it leads to so many other disasters. Now, that in a nutshell is why we should be sitting down in a state of presence, in a state of khushu' when we are consuming food, right? The other thing is that I touched on was mixing beverages with food, which is an absolute disaster. Because essentially what you are doing is diluting the same acids and enzymes whose sole responsibility is to break down the food for your sake so that you absorb the best of what that food has to offer. These building blocks that are derived from the food will not only mold you into how you look from an aesthetic perspective, but also how you feel, because within food lies micronutrients, not just macronutrients. Now, the proteins, carbs, fats, calories, if we just look at that, that's a very superficial way of looking at food. Essentially, people who count calories or count their macros, most don't pay attention to their micronutrient intake. And vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, antioxidants play a large role in how our cells communicate with one another and how we feel. And I even touched on the benefits of coffee, because a lot of people felt guilty consuming coffee. And I said a large percentage of Australians, 2/3 actually, get their antioxidants from coffee, not from fruit. So a little bit of everything is okay, but it's how you consume it. The beverage mixed with the food is going to dilute the acids and enzymes, not allow them to do their job, which is to break down the food into the building blocks that your body needs to sustain life, optimal physiological condition and cognitive condition. 2/3 of Australians get their antioxidants from coffee, not from fruit. So it's not a matter of you avoiding a whole bunch of different foods. And a lot of people approach food that way. They look at what they're going to have to eliminate when they start or clean up their diet. So anyone who's been doing the wrong thing for a while, when they're about to embark on their healthy journey, the first thing they start to think is, I'm going to cut this out, I'm going to cut that out, and make a mental list of all the things that they're going to cut out. When I prefer people to do this exercise, you can try it yourself. Get 2 pieces of paper. On one piece of paper, write down all the foods that you think you have to avoid in order to start your journey of being healthier. And then on the other piece of paper, write a list of all the good foods that you know of: capsicum, peas, steak, I don't care what it is, from all food groups. Make a list of all the foods that are good for you that you have not eaten in the last 6 months. And I guarantee you that list of foods that you have not eaten, the good foods, is going to be far greater than the list of the foods that you have to avoid. There are copious amounts of foods that an individual can eat and must eat. And nature has made it very easy for us to navigate food. Food comes in different colors. The different colors that exist are present because of the phytonutrients and antioxidants that are in there, which give it their color. So there are certain nutrients in a blueberry that make the blueberry blue, in a strawberry that make the strawberry red, in a raspberry that make it a darker red. So these things make it easier for us to navigate so that we ensure that our micronutrient intake is sufficient. And a lot of elite athletes that I've worked with in the past, their clubs teach them how to navigate food that way, because the layman doesn't understand the terms that I just used now. Not everybody, you're not born knowing what phytonutrients are and antioxidants are. Some people don't know what macros are, and that's okay. It's not taught. It's not part of our curriculum. So when even elite athletes are taught how to eat, they are often questioned with questions such as, have you eaten anything orange today? Have you eaten anything green today? And the answers to those questions will determine whether that individual has a balanced diet. But back to what I was saying about combining food with water. The water or any other beverage dilutes the acids that are trying to break the food down, making it an absolute mission for your stomach to absorb the nutrients and the goodness from the food. Separate those two entities. Hypothetically, if I was walking into a restaurant and there's table water, or I've ordered some sparkling water, for instance, I may drink until the food arrives, because drinking prior to the food arriving or prior to eating is going to prime your stomach for what it's about to endure and start the process of digestion by the beverage arriving in the stomach prior to the food. However, once you start to eat, drinking should cease, and then after finishing your food, wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It takes a bit of getting used to. The first time I did this, it took about 2 weeks to get accustomed to it. But you would stop for about 15 minutes if you can. Minimum, if you can't, 5 minutes. There has to be some sort of an intermission between the two. Allow your stomach to start processing the food before you drink and dilute the acids and enzymes. The problem that we have with modernity is that everything is refrigerated when it comes to beverages, and nobody likes to drink room temperature anymore. Everything is cold, straight out of the fridge. Within that lies another issue, another and potentially dangerous issue too, because your body is roughly 36 degrees Celsius, and beverages that are in the fridge are sitting at 4 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius. And when you are eating food, once you've consumed food, all food becomes liquid. It goes from a solid state into a liquefied state. So the food is in a liquefied state in your stomach, passing through the intestines. Then you subject that food that's in a liquefied state to a beverage. It's 36 degrees, by the way, the same temperature as your body, to a beverage that's 4 degrees. Now, when you expose something that's in your system at 36 degrees to a temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, you are actively solidifying some of the components in the food that is in your stomach and traveling through your intestines. And that is not only an issue of discomfort and an issue that can lead to intolerances, food intolerances, and even allergies in time, but it's also a dangerous exercise because these food molecules that are being that are now in a liquefied state, these proteins, these carbs, these lipids, the fats, when fats are solidified within the stomach and solidified as they travel through the arteries, it's not a safe exercise to partake in. You don't want anything that could potentially cause any clotting in your blood merely because you couldn't hold back on drinking whilst eating. So that is a major reason why we need to avoid mixing the two and separate the two actively. The other one is biological availability of food, the order in which we eat our food. So if the food arrives at the table and the food is, the plate arrives and the plate consists of some salad or some vegetables, some protein, and there happen to be carbohydrates on that meal, in this meal, I would consume the vegetables and the salad first because my body can benefit from the fiber within that food. And it's a lot easier to digest. And then afterwards, eat the protein with the carbohydrates together. Some nutritionists go a little bit too far and say, okay, you should eat your protein and then your carbohydrates last, or your carbohydrates, then your protein afterwards, and separate them by 15 minutes. I don't think that's realistic. I don't see anybody going to a restaurant and then eating their greens, waiting 15 minutes, eating their protein, waiting 15 minutes, and then eating a cold steak or a cold piece of barramundi. It's not realistic. It's not going to make sense. The carbohydrate and the protein digest roughly at the same rate, so it's not an issue if you combine the two. That rate is anywhere between 2 to 3, even 4 hours, depending on how healthy your gut is. However, the vegetables and salads, and this goes for fruit as well, and that's why you should never eat fruit after a meal, they digest within as little as 7 to 15 minutes. So you should not be consuming them with something that takes a lot longer to digest, and you should definitely not be consuming them at the end of the meal. I often see people eat their protein and carbs and then eat their salad at the end because they don't want to get full on salad and veg. They want to be able to consume their protein, the star of the dish, first. And even worse, I see people consuming fruit after the food. Now, if you're eating food in an order that is incorrect when it comes to biological availability, and what that means in English is how long the food takes to digest. So, for example, a steak can take 3 hours to digest. If I eat a steak and then I eat fruit afterwards, the fruit will potentially cause gastrointestinal distress. It can cause gas, bloating, and an array of different issues if it goes in after the steak and it cannot get through. And some research shows, although it's arguably not the case, that even fermentation can occur and cause even greater issues. On the flip side, if you were to consume your fruit first, you're going to prime your stomach for what it's going to endure. So So you're preparing it for a more arduous exercise, which is the digestion of a food that is rougher in texture, like the steak. You're going to absorb all the vitamins and minerals that fruit has to offer. You're going to absorb the fiber that the fruit has to offer. And all of these things your body not only needs for itself, for physiological function, for cell function, but your body needs these things in order to help it be able to consume the food that is a lot tougher in texture, such as the steak. The fiber will help you digest the steak with a lot more ease and take that stress away from the organs and from your stomach when it comes down to breaking these foods, because they are very, very tough to break down, and they have a really high thermic effect. We discussed the thermic effect before. The thermic effect is how many calories your body uses or expends in the digestion process of this food. So these, in Islamic tradition, these things are not an accident. These habits that the Prophet ﷺ had and reiterated for us to follow, they are not mere coincidence. They are not an accident. And we believe that all of the prophets consumed food in the same way. لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله. So we don't differentiate between the two. We believe Abraham alayhi salam ate that way. We believe Isa alayhi salam ate that way. Jesus, we believe Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam ate that way. And even if you look at paintings and images from the past, you wouldn't see people standing eating food. Food was something that was appreciated, and it was an event. Being able to feast was an event. And back then, foods didn't consist of a multitude of ingredients like it does today. So it was a little bit easier to digest. These days, a single food item can contain up to 30 different ingredients, when in the past that was considered a bad sign. You know, food consisted of 3 or 4 different ingredients. And you'll notice even with cooking shows, those who like to watch cooking shows and contests like My Kitchen Rules and MasterChef and things like that, when an individual has to cook a meal that consists of minimal ingredients, it's very, very difficult because you've got nothing to hide behind. Your flaws are exposed. If you don't get the taste and texture and flavors and everything correct, it's easy to identify. Whereas if you've got a multitude of ingredients all intertwined together, your taste buds don't know what's going on, and it's very easy to mask a flaw in your cooking or a flaw in your method of approach to preparation of food when there's that many different ingredients. And one story tells us that when the Prophet ﷺ and his family and his companions made hijrah, and they noticed that there was banquets filled with 17 different dishes on the table, that instead of being excited, they were somewhat held back, because they were taken back, thinking that is this what mankind has come to, overabundance and gluttony, and that's not what Islam is about. One of the other things that is encouraged in the tradition of Islam is eating with the hands. Now, a lot of people tend to say when they see certain cultures eating with their hands, that this is a very primitive approach to the consumption of food. We have to keep in mind that the fork came about before the chopsticks. A lot of people think that the chopsticks were around, and then some genius came around and said, what are you guys doing eating chopsticks? And this is within the Eastern tradition. What are you guys doing eating with chopsticks when you can use a fork? It's a lot more advanced. No, it's actually the other way around. An orangutan can use a fork. It takes a human being to be able to use chopsticks. And within the Asian tradition, the chopsticks didn't come about as a sign of intellect initially. Initially, it was a scarcity of material. So cutlery required a lot more, it was a lot more difficult to create because of the material required to create it. Metals were used, and it was a lot more expensive. So when they were cooking in large pots, to be able to reach into a large pot and stir something or take something out, you would need a large utensil. Whereas 2 pieces of wood, essentially, which is what chopsticks are, very cheap, easy to make, and instead of figuring out how you're going to get food from a very large pot deep down in the pot, you would be able to use the chopsticks. And then they stuck around because not only was it a more economically viable way of making utensils to consume food in, but it was also a sign of intellect because it requires effort to be able to use chopsticks. The reason why I mention that analogy is that it's not everything is as it seems. It doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody is using chopsticks that that's primitive, just like if somebody is using their hand, that is not primitive. We eat fruit. A lot of us, we eat fruits like apples and pears and things like that with our hands. That's not frowned upon. And so in some traditions, when we see cultures eating food with their hands, we have to ask ourselves, where does this stem from? And in the Islamic tradition, eating with your hands not only makes you more conscious of what you're consuming, the quantity that you are consuming, the portion sizes that you are consuming, the portion of each mouthful that you are consuming, because there's only so much that you can use with your thumb and the two fingers. It's very, very interesting because research shows from a science perspective now, we're not talking about Islam, but everything has hikmah, subhanAllah. When you touch food, the calculation that I mentioned earlier of when the food lands in your mouth, when the food lands in your mouth and then makes its way to the, past the esophagus and everything else into the stomach and into the intestines, when the food goes through that process, the brain is telling the stomach what's happening and preparing the stomach for what it's about to endure. But that equation, that algorithm can start earlier if you physically touch your food. To touch the food, to take a morsel of food, you have to look at what you are going to consume. Your brain analyzing what you're about to touch, your senses in your fingertips as they touch the food, and I'll get to the other benefit of the flora and the fingertips. When they touch the food, let's say I grab a piece of pear and I grab that piece of pear, my brain is now telling my stomach the piece of pear that Moody's about to consume is of this size, is of this weight. And this is something that is going on in your brain while you are in a state of complete heedlessness. So you're not doing this algorithm yourself. You're not doing this calculation yourself. Your brain is doing that to allow you to absorb more from the nutrition that's in the food. So that process of calculation between the brain and the stomach can occur a lot earlier if one was to use their hands. The other remarkable thing is that science tells us, research shows, that the fingertips contain a type of flora, a bacteria on them that once they make contact with the food that you're about to consume, that you activate a lot of the enzymes, a lot of the nutrients to make them easier to digest. So, for example, we have all heard of activated almonds and, activated walnuts and Brazil nuts and all this sort of thing. Really, they are just foods that have been exposed to water because some of the ingredients in these whole foods are very difficult and tough for the stomach to digest. And so activating the nutrients in them makes it easier for your stomach to absorb what they have to offer. Much like touching the food and the healthy flora, the healthy bacteria that sits on the fingertips, once it makes contact with the food, increases the digestibility of that food group. Oats is another great example. A lot of people self-diagnose themselves when eating oats. They'll say, I'm gluten intolerant or I'm intolerant to oatmeal. Everybody bloats when they eat oats because beta-glucan and a lot of the other ingredients within oatmeal, we won't get into too much scientific terminology and start confusing people, but oats bloat everybody if they are not soaked overnight and activated. There are things within foods that are very difficult for the stomach to digest and absorb if they are not activated. And oats are a fine example. When you have oats at home, they don't taste the same as they do in a cafe. In a cafe, they always have a little bit of a sweet aftertaste, and they're a lot easier on the stomach because most restaurants and cafes will soak their oats overnight, some of them in almond milk or oat milk, but most cafes and restaurants will soak their oats in actually apple juice. And that makes the oats easier to digest and gives it a nice sweet aftertaste as well. So using the hands is by no means a coincidence in our tradition. And in a lot of cultures, that's what's done. So we have to reflect on when we see different cultures approaching food differently. Instead of being very quick to pass judgment, we have to ask ourselves why. Why in the Asian tradition do they use the chopsticks? Why in this particular culture do they use their hands? There's a hikmah, there's a reason, and a very legitimate reason behind everything that we see around us. Now, the other hikmah point I wanted to discuss was the issue of red meat. There's a lot of confusion about the hadith that says that the Prophet ﷺ recommended that the individual eat red meat once a week and twice a week, with a bit more leniency if the person came from an affluent background and was more accustomed to eating meat on a regular basis. Meat was not something that was consumed daily. The Prophet ﷺ was semi-vegetarian, so he would not eat copious amounts of meat, and it was not recommended to eat meat in large quantities, and definitely not more than once or twice a week. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is that when that hadith came to fruition, it was regarding the an'am, the cattle of Mecca, not the ones from Medina. And the reason why I point that out is the cattle in Medina at the time, in Yathrib, as it was called, was green and had luscious land, and the cattle grazed freely. And they had a natural grass-fed diet. Whereas the an'am, the cattle of Mecca, you're talking about desert terrain. A lot of the animals in that particular region ate leftover food, scraps, whatever the equivalent of processed meat, if I could call it that. So if I was to make a comparison between the cattle from those two regions, it would be grass-fed and not even grain-fed, but processed, because they were not even eating grain either. Grain was used for human beings to consume, to make bread. Bread was considered a meal within itself. So meat was very different in Medina as it was in Mecca. Now, the interesting analogy between the hadith and the science is that there was a study recently, and by the way, non-grass-fed meat, processed meat, is now considered a carcinogenic of the highest category, aligned with smoking. I think it's a category 4 carcinogenic with smoking. So it's not a matter of if it can cause cancer, but it's just a matter of time of when it will cause cancer. And that is the issue. Now, the Prophet ﷺ said meat once a week, twice a week if you come from an affluent background, and we differentiated between the an'am, the cattle from Medina, and the cattle from Mecca. Now, in Medina, grass-fed didn't have the same issues. Where is the correlation in science today? Well, there was a study that I was looking at, and those of you who know my background in research methodology know that I love research. I get research emailed to me on a daily basis. Being part of the Sydney University alumni, I love to break down research, whether it's about food or not, anything to do with the human body. I find extremely interesting. This one particular study showed that not maybe, but if you do consume processed meat as a quantity of more than 70 grams over a period of 7 days, and I think 7 days was being used because the radioactive half-life of the chemical that is toxic within meat had a span of 7 days. So basically it sits in your blood for 7 days before it starts to reduce in its potency unless it's topped up. So if you consume 70 grams of meat per day over 7 days, then it's not a case of you may, but you will get cancer, and it's just a matter of time. That's what this study is indicating. Now, Allah Ta'ala alam whether that's the case or not, but it's very, very interesting. Now, nobody eats 70 grams of meat in a sitting unless they've had a gastric sleeve done, and they're very, very restricted to how much food that they can consume in one sitting. What was interesting, though, was it doesn't matter if it's 70 grams per day or if it's 490 grams per week, because 70 grams over 7 days is 490 grams per week. If you analyze that and you break it down, you can be generous and round it up to 500 grams over 7 days, if you were to break that down into 2 servings of 250 grams each, which is the average serving of a piece of steak if you go to a nice steakhouse. The average serving on the menu is 250 grams. 250 times 2, 500 over 7 days translates to twice a week. So the advice that we were given 1446 years ago now, it was 1445, but this month we started 1446 Hijri. This advice was given to us over almost 1500 years ago, which is remarkable. And following this protocol is important when it comes to processed meat, but it does not pertain to grass-fed meat. That's where the confusion lies, because a lot of us eat meat more frequently than twice a week, and some of us think that, you know, this is forbidden and it's not good and it's bad. If it's grass-fed, there's no harm in it, because grass-fed meat, even the fat in grass-fed meat is good for you. The fat in grass-fed meat, and I said this about 20 years ago. I remember when I was working with GNC. They don't exist in Australia anymore, but they're a big supplement company in the United States. And I said over 20 years ago, I said when I was doing some research, I said CLA, which is the fat in grass-fed meat, is going to be a standalone ingredient, and it's going to be a fat burner that is sold separately. And now it is. CLA is a very, very popular supplement that is sold for targeting stubborn fat. And CLA essentially comes from the fat in grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, and CLA is conjugated linoleic acid. It's very, very effective. It's an essential fat like omega-3, but very effective at targeting stubborn fat. So that rule, that general rule of thumb, does not apply to grass-fed meat. Wallahu ta'ala alam. That is the end of this particular episode. So I just wanted to touch on a few different hikmah points. Sitting down when you're eating, sitting down when you're drinking, don't drink with your food, don't mix the biological availability of foods, eat things that are smoother in texture first, rougher in texture afterwards, why some cultures eat with their hands, and also the hikmah behind red meat and the advice that we were given by our beloved Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam with regards to how frequently we consume red meat. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Alhamdulillah alladhi hadana lihadha wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah, wa salli wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim taslima. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.